right, we start with a very unusual composition this morning. And you get an A+ if you recognize what this is. Let's go. Okay, since there's a pause in the structure, all right, I want you to skip ahead a little bit, right about halfway through. This piece is like, could be 5 hours long, right? Does it ring a bell with anybody? No. This is supposedly a famous piece. Okay, let's go again. Oh, wait. The first interval is a what?
Fifth.
Yeah, and what fifth is that?
D.
Based on what note?
D.
D, A, yes. Okay, and then we're hearing two other notes. What?
Do and mi.
Yeah, do and mi.
Or do sharp or mi sharp.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Well, I think I'm a better quarter sharp.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the middle. Yeah.
It's my favorite part of the piano.
Have we made any progress? Okay, skip ahead. Just skip ahead.
That's it.
What? That's the whole thing? It can't be.
Oh, okay.
It's,
Oh, I found the other one.
So hard too.
yeah, okay. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
wow.
good. That's fine. Yeah.
What's it back?
It's a ritornello.
Okay, all right. Turn that off. Okay. All right? What do you think about that? By the way, what were those pictures right there? What?
FAC.
What?
Fa la do.
Yeah, okay, so we've actually progressed to that. Okay? All right, the fa and the la might be part of that DA thing, right? So you got that triad going. And then you've got C and E way back there. Yeah? Okay, well, what kind of sound is that? We all can recognize the pitches, right? Okay? What if you sat in an orchestra and played like that?
Well, if it was notated to B quarter tones, then
Well,
it would be correct.
think that's quarter tones? Anybody know what that is?
It sounds like prepared piano or something a little bit.
No, it's a piano.
It sounds microtonal. It sounds like it's based on the overtone series, actually,
Uh,
probably.
Well, those are two different things, I think.
Not really.
Well, I think so. Microtonalism is things that occur in between pure intervals, yes?
Yeah, but do you really think that the like 12th and up to 20th overtones and whatever are actually interpreted by the ear as being pure intervals?
No, because
think
it
it's
doesn't
microtonal.
interpret them.
Yeah.
It interprets them in a much more subtle way. But it's not those upper harmonics. Actually, no harmonic above harmonic 8 is used to define a pitch, a fundamental pitch.
Well,
And as, yes, go ahead.
I was gonna say, actually, continue what you were saying.
No, go ahead.
No, it was off topic, or a little bit off topic.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, maybe, like, the question is, like, whether he, like, specifically, like, wanted it to be, like, like, a specific, like, number of cents out of tune, or if it was just, like, written to be, like, slightly, like, jarringly off. Maybe, well, that's, like, what I'm wondering, is, like, is it intentionally, like, you know, like, 3 cents sharp, and, like, therefore, like, sort of, like, can be interpreted as microtonal in a way, like Lydia's saying, or is it just, like, supposed to be kind of out of tune
I
sounding?
think they're exactly tuned to the overtones.
Hmm.
That's my hypothesis.
Well,
I think
But
so.
I'm
well,
speaking
that's
as
an
I know the
interesting
neighborhoods.
remark, and there, I think that's partially true. Pardon the pun.
It's
But
like, to me, like, it just sounded out of tune, like jarringly. So,
really?
yeah.
And you're an organist and you play the harpsichord? Oh my goodness.
And I still thought it was
How
out of tune.
devastating. Don't tell your
I know,
harpless chord teacher that.
I don't have any right to say that because I can't tune my
No,
instrument.
I'm teasing, totally teasing. Well, this is a composition that basically was in progress from 1964 until, oh gosh, the 70s or the 80s. I think the first performance of that was in literally 1975, something like that. I could be off. But that's by composer Lamont Young. Anybody ever heard of him? No.
Yes.
Considered to be probably the first minimalist composer, right? But I bring that up because I don't recognize that really as what we normally associate with minimalism, but it's like the bare bones beginnings. And the other person that's generally associated with the beginning of minimalism is
Glass, right?
Terry
Terry Rice.
Riley.
Oh,
Riley, right?
not right.
Okay. And it's interesting that Young and Riley were born same year, 1935. And both of them were experimenting with a lot of things that seemed new at the time, in the 60s. And what were the new things? Well, the discovery or the sudden appearance of catalogs or recordings of world music, right? And so Indian music in particular, the obsession with the music from India. And what are the specific features about that? There's one overruling feature, which is actually a feature of most world music or natural musical systems, including Western music at the beginning, whatever that is. Yes, the drone, right?
Oh.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. But all right, well, this piece is called the well-tuned piano, and presumably it is well-tuned, and so your score has gone up, right? So it does use a certain aspect of the overtone series. No one knows what, they've never heard this kind of sound. I've heard this sound so much that it warped my mind. Not really. It was warped long before I heard this. No one recognizes this as a tuning system?
like just?
Yes, it's just intonation. That's the tuning, is just intonation. And as a matter of fact, it gives me an opportunity to talk about the significance of just intonation. Yes, okay, I'll do that. Okay, well, then I'll probably need this. Okay, so let's say we've got that. We've got that fundamental. Yes? And then we're going to construct its boundary. You've heard all this many times before. And its fifth harmonic. So we've got the fundamental, or the first harmonic, the third harmonic, and the fifth harmonic. Well, those two things brought into, this is not in the right octave register, you know that, but brought into an octave alignment, you get that chord, right? Okay, so then let's go to that boundary interval and create the same procedure. And you get this. And then let's consider the C as the fifth harmonic of a sub-fundamental. And it turns out that this relationship to the original fundamental is 3 to 2, and this relationship is its inverse, 2 to 3. Well, these 3 fifths, or triads that are formed, actually, if we put them in a scalar fashion, yield the diatonic scale, right? Now, in my book, I say that this is the origin in our minds of the diatonic system. But the difference between this as a tuning system and how the brain uses this information to compute music abstractly, there are two different things. What is sound anyway?
Vibrations in the air.
Yeah, it's air molecules, the movement of air molecules, right? In a periodic wave form, yes? Discrete pitch. I've said on a number of other occasions that the concept of discrete pitch is probably much later than speech pitch, speech that is used in language. It's extrapolated basically from the same process, but it's a different entity. Discrete pitch is processed probably in the right hemisphere of the brain, in the temporal lobe. Yes, the superior sulcus or gyrus or whatever, or Heschel's gyrus. That's where the mapping of discrete pitch is supposedly instantiated. On the left-hand side is speech pitch, the mapping for speech pitch. Now, even in speech pitch and in discrete pitch, there is no way. What is sound? If it's just the movement of air molecules and in a periodic wave form, then what is creating the idea of sound?
Whatever it vibrates through the medium.
In the brain?
Yes, your mind or your brain is creating it. So it is a percept. It doesn't exist out there. Really, it's an interpretation of a specific mechanical periodic waveform, and the brain assesses that sensory input, and out of it, right, it creates percepts, one for speech, the other discrete pitch for music. So sound in the brain is abstract. Are you following all this? It's easy to follow, I think. So therefore, this system as a phonotactic system, as an expression of the sensory motor system, right, is a representation of discrete pitch. However, in the mind, as a symbolic representation of the representing system for discrete pitch. It is purely abstract. And what it is dealing with is the ratios that exist between these three entities. And this system is closed off. There's no need to move beyond any kind of fifth movement, higher and or lower, because once you move up here, you introduce pitches that are already contained in some form or another inside of these. So if you move down lower, you introduce B flat, right? If you move higher, you've introduced what? F sharp. Yeah? The next fifth up, right, is D, A, F sharp, yeah? Both B and F are already included as pitches, diatonic pitches in the series. I think there's a very strong argument for assuming that this system is the system of abstract symbolic significance in the brain that produces the notion of discrete pitch. And it can be used, if you believe that the brain is operating in a computational way, that can be used to construct discrete structural expressions of an infinite with an infinite property. It can go on forever. But then it remains to be seen exactly what other recursive elements that can give you that digital infinity. Now, that's a series of assumptions that you have to make, but there's strong empirical evidence that has arisen over the past 40 years or so that strongly supports both this theory and also the computational theory of linguistic structure. What you're hearing here is the result of a phonotactic system, which is this tuning system of discrete pitches. But the brain, the computational symbolic representing system in the brain, does not use sound in that way. They are abstract representations. What's the first evidence that that is so? Even if we're listening to this tuned piano in this particular system. What is obvious about this? I dare say that if you played any pitch, and Mr. Young has not introduced any kind of accidentals, probably for a reason, if you've ever tried to play accidentals in either mean tone or just intonation, that's worse, right? It's like more horrifying than this. But what's a kind of piece of evidence that you can use that the perception of discrete pitch is symbolic and that it is represented through the phonotactic system? Just listening to this.
Language?
No. What about this? Play a little more of it. Go back to the beginning. Okay? All right. What pitches are you hearing? Yeah, there's a fifth, right? Okay. And there's a do in there, yeah? Okay? Now, how do you recognize those pitches? You say that the first thing you said was they're out of tune. That it's microtonal, right? The truth is that they are perfectly tuned.
Does it have to do with the fact that we're hearing them in relation to each other?
Which means what?
Well, if they're in tune with each other, even if they're like microtones away
It
from,
doesn't have anything to do with the audible sounds.
yeah,
It has to do that your mind is registering first in relationship as a symbolic entity. They're registering them as symbols. Yes? And that has nothing to do with the phonotactic representation. So therefore, both in language and in natural musical systems, it is not the sound, the literal physical representation of the phonotactic elements, but it is the symbolic representation that is a key to understanding those systems. And if you look at it that way, you begin to see that there is a common thread that runs through all natural musical systems in the world. It's all the same, totally the same. The phonotactic representation, which in many cultures contains microtonal inflections, create differences. It's exactly the same in language. Every language has a conception of vowel and consonants. However, the conceptions of vowel and consonants phonotactically differ substantially from culture to culture. But even those systems are highly constrained. They can only operate in a specific way. All of that information is basically come about empirically, not empiricistly, but empirically from the 60s and the 70s till
so
today.
if that interval were tuned slightly differently, like if it wasn't, if the two pitches were not like in tune with each other the way they were, like if it was like a very wide or very narrow fifth,
Mhm.
would our ear not interpret the pitches the same way?
No, you would interpret them the
Okay.
same way.
Okay,
You interpret them the same way.
yeah.
The thing, when I was in Louisville in September, Sebastian Chang and I were walking back to the apartment, I mean the what do you call it, the hotel, and outside the hotel was a calliope. You ever heard of a calliope? And I don't know what tuning system that calliope it was in, but you know, it could have been some kind of linear scale or, you know, tempered scale, but it was not tempered very well. But it was playing a well-known, like, circus tune. And I asked Sebastian, I said, can you sing that melody? And of course, he was able to sing it immediately. But the thing was grossly, what I would consider, out of tune. And I said, what does that show you? It shows you that your mind interprets relationships between the symbols, not phonotactically per se. And my interest in all of this stems from my interest in language and linguistics, but it also stems from my obsession with trying to figure out what is music, what constitutes music, and what are the commonalities between cultures. And the first thing you have to understand is that we're talking about music that is natural to a particular society or tribe, or I don't want to use the word civilization, and not some process of the intellect. Now, in trying to get my thoughts together about minimalism, which I think is the most significant movement in the history of music in the 20th century. I think it's a defining moment. I think it's a revolutionary and synthetic moment in the 20th century. And we have spent this semester trying to go through these moments in music history that have acted as like bridge points or culmination points at which things can depart and move on. And I've used it to support my idea that the history of music can be thought of as a period of experimentation, followed by a period of selection from what you've been experimenting with, and then a period of synthesis where you put what has come before, if anything, with what you've been through, and it creates a kind of stable or stationary point for a while. Then that process goes on again. Well, no one yet has come up with what the, let's say, the atomic primitives might be in language, other than to say that it appears that word-like objects are the primitive entities. And that's as far as you can go. And there are many reasons why that is as far as you can go. Because you think of the word, and philosophers nowadays, you know, they go into fits of ecstasy in discussing what does the word red mean? What does the word apple or red apple mean? Well, that brings up the huge problem in linguistics that if you consider the brain as a kind of modular structure, and as Randy Gallistel suggests, that there are different computations for different cognitive activities or processes in the brain. It says that any particular one cognitive function may combine a whole bunch of different modular things in the brain and contribute to the expression of one thing. Well, words are like that, yes? It's obviously contains some kind of phonotactic representation, but then it's got to contain essentially some kind of syntactical property. And that's a symbolic property. And it says it is a symbol or combinations of symbols that's projecting information to other combinations that can be hooked together to produce some kind of coherent expression. Syntax in language is the only definition that you can give to meaning. Because if you start to say, what does the phrase flying airplanes can be dangerous, what does that mean? Well, it's ambiguous. Why? For many reasons. Because it depends on how you group the constituents together. Flying planes can be dangerous, or flying planes can be dangerous, right? Yeah. If I were to be flying a plane, it certainly would be dangerous, right? If you were standing on the shore and looking at the plane that I was flying, you would turn to your neighbor and say, wow, flying planes can be dangerous. It's going to come right for me. And the other thing is, you know, what do the individual words actually mean? Plane.
I mean, like, four things.
That's a homonym, yes?
Something flat.
It could be an instrument that a carpenter uses, yes? It could be a term in geometry, or as I used to spell it in the 6th grade, geometry, right? Or it could be like an actual, you know, thing that moves in the air. Do planes actually fly?
Yeah.
No, they don't. Birds fly. That would be like saying a submarine swims. See? There is no coherent notion of meaning like that. Right?
What about flying planes are dangerous and flying planes is dangerous?
Nice.
Well,
There you go.
there you go. That,
So why,
It
isn't
clarifies
the issue
it.
here really that can needs more forms?
well, flying planes is dangerous.
Proposed.
It could be somebody that, you know, either is clarifying the situation or doesn't know grammar.
Yeah.
Right? You know, I'm on the ground here and looking up at the balcony, and someone says, and I say up there, throw me down the keys. I've said this 1,000 times. Throw me down the keys. You know exactly what that means, right? Person tosses the keys down to me, right? At any rate, what I'm trying to say, notions of meaning in linguistics is very difficult if you move beyond the relationship the syntactical relationship between words. And then it occurred to me, oh, music is devoid of that. And so it is possible that you could actually find out what the symbols are that are used in music. And it turns out that it is the diatonic pitches that constitutes a viable candidate for the symbolic representation of musicalistic systems. All right, so much for that. Okay. In researching all of this, or getting my thoughts together, I came across an article. Actually, it was a TED Talk by someone. Now, that is, the TED Talks are wonderful and they're marvelous and incredible, and most of them are ridiculous. And it's a free world, and you can watch whatever you want to, but unfortunately I was watching this one, and I was led to watch this one, and in it was a description about basically the history of Western music. And the ideas that were put forth was, first of all, music was put together instinctually. And then as it became notated, it became I have to be careful of the word, an aspect of intelligence. And so, somewhere down the line in that TED Talk, which went on far too long, right, it said that, well, now, instinct in music is improvisation, and composition in music is an expression of intelligence. This is from a very, very well respected, even I respect this particular person.
Still.
Well, I mean, it kind of went down 5 points, I think. Right? That is the status of thinking about music among musicians, not the kind of people who are trying to explore what is the cognitive nature of music. Unfortunately, most of those people aren't on the level of this person that I'm referring to, musically speaking. At any rate, then I also read this extraordinarily strange comment that the reason why we came to this idea of minimalism and how minimalism incorporates aspects of world music, and it represents a kind of new approach to tonality. Well, you know, I buy some of that. But then it goes on to say, well, the mechanism that allowed that to happen was the recording industry. Make that connection. So if you went into the little store that I used to go into in like 1400, audiophile down in the village, they had all these, you know, hard to find recordings. And they had a huge section of world music recording. This was in the 70s, right? And remember, well, maybe you don't know, it's during this time that minimalism was the thing, right? It was like this revolutionary thing. And it was at the height of Reich's prominence and fame. He's still alive today and continuing. But that was a big force in music. So this article or whatever says that suddenly all these different types of music and styles were available through recording, right? And it's changed the way in which people thought about music. Instead of the old style, where styles were more vertically contained, and one style moved more or less to the next style, and to the next style, and to the next style. What are the implications for that?
That minimalism was a great leap in everything.
No, just the recording industry, and about the notion of musical progress or musical style. Is that the way in which music progressed from what we tried to demonstrate from Periton all the way to Landini, to Josquin des Prez, to Monteverdi, to Haydn, to Beethoven, to Wagner, which we skipped, and to Steve Reich and the other minimalists? Are those styles like vertically closed off in one period? Is that really the historicist view of
No.
music history or
We
any
only see
kind
it
of
that
style?
way in retrospect.
What?
We only see it that way in retrospect in our effort to sort of label things and simplify it.
Well, what is the difference? What is the fundamental difference between the music of Haydn and the music of Wagner?
Couple hundred years.
Trombones.
I'm talking about the music.
Form.
Chromaticism.
There's chromaticism in Haydn.
In a different way.
If it hadn't been for the chromatic expansion that occurred in Haydn, you would neither have gotten Beethoven nor Wagner. So if that is true, the kind of compartmentalization of musical styles is false. Yes? So I think what you say in your philosophy about certain things really does have an impact on looking at the phenomenon of music itself, or any other phenomenon. And that's why it's very important in constructing a theoretical view that you pay attention to what you're actually trying to set up in your philosophy or in your theory. All right. Now, I would like for us to listen first to 4 organs.
The Philly Organ
Imagine
Quartet.
that.
Oh no.
Do you know that piece?
The Philly Organ Quartet, the group.
4 organs.
4 organs.
I learned about it yesterday actually in my music history class, which is covering minimalism.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
They cover that
Did you
down
hear an
today.
example of it?
Yep. Our teacher said, while I try to be tolerant of most music, I really can't stand this piece.
Who's your teacher?
Probably not gonna name him for the sake of the recording.
Patterson?
Starts with P and rhymes with Addison.
I mean, he's the guy that teaches music history too. So.
Good folks on
His
YouTube
last
don't
name.
necessarily know that.
Is it the one with the, you have to use the one with the people, you looking at them from the top? Yeah, mm-hmm. Stop. Stop. Listen to the maracas. You know, the first time I went to Mexico, I was about 5 years old, maybe 4.5 or 5 years old. And my grandfather bought me a pair of maracas. I still have them. That's the ones that are used in this recording. Okay, let's go again. I want you to listen to the maracas only. Stop it right before the organ comes in, or at the organ. Stop. How many shakes of the maracas?
8 till 16.
I think less.
14?
Listen again. There's a reason why I'm asking you this. How many?
12.
11.
And then
There are 11, okay? Now, what's odd about 11?
Well,
Did you talk about this yesterday?
the number 11 is
Prime
odd.
number. Ha ha.
Did you talk about this in your class yesterday?
No.
It's a survey course.
Mhm. What is the number 11? You, as a mathematician, you ought to know what 11 is.
It's a prime number.
It's a prime number. What is a prime number?
A number that's only divisible by 1 in itself.
Yes, okay? All right, but in music, you know, that doesn't particularly carry any weight, per se. It might. Say if you had a composition that was in 11/8, right? which I think this particular piece is in, right? How would you conduct that?
Carefully.
All right? You'll see. Let's start it again. No, go ahead. No, start over again. Okay? All right. So the subdivision is what?
3 plus 8.
3 plus 8, yes. So if you were to notate that in quarter values, the first beat would be what? A dotted quarter, right? Followed by what?
Lots of.
4 quarters, yes? Okay. Is that not right? Right. So there is a possible subdivision of this. And that is apparent from the very beginning. Gives a kind of syncopated effect to it. Yeah? Because one of those eighth notes, according to a perceived quarter note pulse, comes in early. Yeah? You don't think about that. It's 3 plus 8. All right? And it creates a very distinctive, recognizable rhythmic pattern. Well, actually, I think that Mr. Reich says that the perception of rhythmic features in his music is subtactile. You discuss that in your class? That's one of the basic premises about rhythmic organization in minimal music, is that there's this kind of pulse that goes on, a value, and then the rhythmic progressions unfold against usually a static chord, where a tone or a group of tones begin to change. All right, let's listen to this. Yeah. So the maracas have a specific function in this. Wait a minute. Stop. Something's happened, yes? What has happened?
G sharp.
Yeah. A G sharp from one of those chords is held over an eighth value, yeah? So you begin to hear, well, this is so rude, I don't, you're aware that this is what kind of chord.
There's a lot of fourths.
I think that's Mr. Reich calling. Thank you so much. What kind of chord is this?
A minor? Or 8?
What note is in the bass here?
E.
E! Isn't it an E major chord of some sort? Yeah?
Yesterday.
That's unfair. All right? Okay. And was there any more information communicated?
Yeah, actually, about, should I give it away?
No.
Okay.
I just asked you, was any other information concerning the sonority given away?
Yes.
Okay. And what was that information?
That it was one big dominant.
What?
That was one big, that Reich said something about it being.
No, I don't know. I don't want to know anything about what Mr. Reich said. I want to know what your ear says. Do you not perceive this as an E sound? A kind of E? Right, play it again. Stop. Okay. Now, what is the note on the bottom and what is the note on the top?
E.
What interval is that?
Fourth.
It's a fourth. All right? What else do you hear in that?
A B.
D and F sharp.
Dum, bum, bum. Pardon my intonation, right? And what else do you hear? Bum. Right? And what else? Yes, you know that. You're not.
Well, that's actually from listening to this.
Yes? Okay. All right. So here's the sound. going to be like. Well, it's not too bad. Isn't that it? Am I missing a note?
Stacy.
I don't think so. Yep. That's not right. Yes. Maybe. Yeah. I don't know. I get the impression that that is an E. It's actually an E1197. Okay? Now what does all that mean? E1197.
It's an 11th,
Bunch of
there's a 9th,
thirds.
there's a 7th. and then
Well,
there's a
I'm
third.
glad you said that because it's not. Right? It can be thought of that way, but I think that's a wrong way to think of it.
I
Right?
hear a lot of fourths in the spacing, but I can't hear everything. I
You can't
tell.
hear all those tones?
I mean, I can, but I can't tell where everything is necessarily. But
Well, I
fourths
don't,
are like jumping out at me, but that might just be me hearing things.
well, I mean, there are things. There's the fourth that would exist between A and D. There's the one that would exist in doublings between B and E, right? And then, is there another fourth?
E to A.
And B.
Right. All right. Now, what about this sonority? See if I can play it right. You like that sound?
That's fantastic.
What?
That's fantastic.
I think that's an incredible sound. Yeah? Okay, one of my favorite sounds. What kind of sound is that? What chord is that? And what if I were to change it to major? It's the same chord. Right? Sing me the root of that chord. Absolutely. It's an F major chord, right? Now if I take that apart, I can't play. What did I do? Oh. Yes, if I take that apart, that's the fifth, right? Is there a seventh in this?
Yes.
There it is, right? Okay, and that should really be, comes off of that. Where's the ninth? Right? Right? And where's the 11th?
Top.
Right? So, now, is there another triadic structure other than in that chord?
Yeah.
Sounds like there's an A flat major right in there too.
Right? So, right? And now you know where the origin of so-called bitonalism comes from. And we went through this last year with Petrushka. There is no such thing as bitonalism. All of those tones in that incredibly sensuous chord, regardless of whether it's in minor or major, those three tones that constitute, in this case, the E-flat triad, are all in relationship to F as dissonances, simultaneous dissonances. But isn't it interesting that all three of those dissonances, the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th, when they are sounded together, they produce what?
The consonant.
Consonances.
That's right.
Is it clear what I'm trying to say about that? Right, okay. Well, something like that is going on in this particular setting. So, play the chord again. Start it again. you not hear the two triads, or you can separate it out like that? Da da dum. Bum, 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 right? But those are not, that isn't a bitonal sonority. It's exactly the same kind of sonority that I played, rooted in that. Yeah? Okay. That's a fundamental principle of Reich's minimalism. Don't say that. Okay, now let's go for a little while, because you're going to see that notes begin to change inside of that sonority on the basis of on the clock, on the subtactile eighth note that the maracas is honking out or whatever. And very strange things happen to the phasing of those individual tones. Let's go. This piece goes on for like 15 minutes. Now, just stop for a second. When that appearance of the A goes to the G sharp, right? Does that sound like it's resolving?
It sounds like it goes down to an F sharp.
Da-da! That's a G sharp, isn't it?
Yeah. It sounds like it goes down to an F sharp, which I'm not sure if it's embedded in the chord to begin with.
Yes, it's
or if
embedded
it
in the
was
chord.
added.
It's embedded in the chord. But the hangover of the A creates the impression that you're going da-dum,
Yeah.
right, doesn't it? Does that sound like it moving to a dissonance or moving to a consonance? Yes, of course. I don't know. I don't think you can. Go ahead. Right from there. Now you hear what? Da-da-dum. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, clearly the A sounds like it is moving down to a consonant. Keep going. There's something else that happens in the lower voice. All right, stop. What else is happening in addition to that? It's not all on the top. You know, bum is basically in the bass, or bum, and then you've heard it like 4 times. Bum. Don't you hear that in the bass? Yeah. So it changes the impression of that sonority to what?
D.
Like a 4-2. Got it? E4-2. All right, let's keep going. And so forth and so, stop it, okay? And so forth and so on. And the phasing, it operates such that by the time all these notes get out of phase, they come back into phase. And they're extended in their value. So the original sonority becomes longer and longer and longer and longer, go to close to the end. Not right at the very end, but a little bit before the end. That is the end. But never mind, just keep it there, keep it there, keep it there. No, keep it there, go on. stop it. Now, eventually it's going to end so that you're only left with the E and the A, and then the E finally is subtracted, and you get the A, right? Okay. Suppose you went to a concert and that was on the program following, you know, the Poem of Ecstasy. But no, that's unfair. Following the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony.
Some people think that's minimalist music.
Well, that's why I picked that, okay? Not the Poem of Ecstasy. Although, by the way, you've been practicing that in the orchestra, yeah? Okay, what key is that in?
C.
What? You know that because I've told you that.
Well, it ends in a
Yeah.
giant C major chord, so that's a good clue.
Every detail of that piece is in C major, right? It's an incredible piece, really. One of those pieces when you listen to it and you're immediately brought to tears, especially when you're trying to play it. No. So what about this? Well, you know, this piece was written in 1971, and do remember that I came to the Juilliard School in 1970, right? And so I was there for a lot of things. And you know that I worked a year in class with Jacob Druckmann and a year outside of class with Mr. Druckmann. And then I spent a year at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio with Yusachevsky and Milton Babbitt. So I was there when this stuff happened. I don't need to read it out of a music history book. I am music history. No. So I have a personal connection with all of this. At any rate, I believe that the Boston Symphony gave the premiere performance of this. And it was received okay, you know, those people in Boston.
What does a symphony have to do with a piece for 4 organs? And
It was
maracas?
premiered on a Boston Symphony concert that included this piece of music. And, well, there's a reason for that.
With
Well-
the Pastoral Symphony?
What?
With the Pastoral Symphony?
No, I just said that. Well, it was then brought to New York at Carnegie Hall with the Boston Symphony. I believe it was on a Sunday afternoon concert. Now, who would program a piece like this that didn't have anything to do with the symphony, with 4 organs?
Someone who owes a big favor.
Someone who really likes organs. Can get 4 organs in
Or
one
someone
room.
would you know, was a big proponent of contemporary music. Who was the assistant conductor of the Boston Symphony in the early 70s?
Who's that?
Michael Tilson Thomas.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so the Carnegie Hall premiere of this work, right, was induced a kind of riot because, you know, Sunday afternoon with all those lovely New York people that had been coming to Carnegie Hall to listen to Arthur Rubinstein play for like 100 years, right, suddenly were exposed to this with NTT playing, I think, one of the organs, right? And there was such a riot about this. People started screaming, "Stop!" right? And people were milling around the audience. I'd just love to see this, right? Everything has become so like bland, right? And there was a woman who ran down in front of the stage and apparently said, "Stop, stop, I confess," and took her shoe off and started banging on the stage. This is all documented, corroborated by Reich and
Did
NTT.
anyone pull out their cell phone and start filming that?
There was no cell phone.
That's
Yeah.
true.
All right, at any rate, I think it's all pretty mild, and I'm very much attracted to this kind of music. But it's a good thing that Reich's music made a step forward. But this is a seminal piece in what he's trying to do. And you'll notice that it is a kind of reaction to the austere intellectual serialism which had bombarded music since the 20s through the 50s. And at that time at the Juilliard School, you know, there were two camps. Either you were a serialist or you were some kind of traditional composer. And Reich's teachers were, well, actually, one of them was my teacher, Vincent Persichetti. And he had worked with, he was at the old Juilliard School, which is now the Manhattan School. He worked with Hall Overton. Mr. Overton died in 72 or 73, while I was still at Juilliard. And Vincent Persichetti, and I think that Persichetti outlived him by many, many years. Mr. Persichetti was old, or older when I was there. But those are his basic teachers. And then he went to Mills College in California and studied with Luciano Berio. And it was in contact with Berio that he decided that he'd better change directions.
Sorry, I have to leave early today, but I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, all right. All right, well now, let's go on to the next piece, which is different trains. Did you do this piece?
I know this piece, but I'm not in the music history class.
I don't listen to things unless the music history teacher makes me.
Now, this is a piece that, did anybody know, other than Ladaya, anybody know this piece? Ever heard of this piece?
What's the name?
Different trains.
By Rice.
Unlike Terry Riley and Young, Reich came from a very affluent family. His parents were divorced when he was still very young, and I believe his father stayed in New York and his mother moved to L.A., or it could have been the other way around, I don't remember. And he used to take trains back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast. And that was during the the late 30s and the early 40s, right? Of course, that was right in the middle of World War II. And Reich came up with this idea about long train rides, or train rides, people riding on trains. And he constructed this piece in 3 movements. The first movement is about American trains. And what he did was to interview 2 people. He interviewed his governess as a child, and he interviewed this Pullman car operator, a conductor on a train. And he took fragments of their interviews and he turned them into some kind of speech pitch. And he uses that as a kind of melodic impetus for the first movement. Then in the second movement, he has this idea that, people were taking different kinds of train rides in Europe during the 40s. And so he interviews 3 Holocaust survivors, and he takes fragments of their interviews and he constructs that middle movement. Then there's a final movement, which is post-war, and it's a combination of the phrases from the first and some phrases from the Holocaust survivors. And it won a Grammy Award as the best classical piece of 1988, I think. So this is very, pretty mainstream Reich after all of his technical stuff had been worked out. And this particular recording, which is very famous, is the Kronos Quartet. And it is for tape, Kronos, the quartet, and the tape is a multi-tracked, and the quartet plays not only live music, but it also plays recorded music. And so it's the equivalent to basically 4 different quartets playing, plus the electronically manipulated train sounds, plus the musically manipulated speech. And it's an incredible piece. And long gone is the kind of static impression of 4 organs, but you still get these grids of single structures, vertical structures, that are displayed or rhythmically varied in that same kind of subtactile pulse, but it's much more rich and diverse in the variety inside those chords. Okay? The first movement, we're not going to listen to all, we'll listen to about the first 3 minutes of this. Apparently it was one of the fastest trains.
You don't say.
That train from New York. That train from New York.
It's funny to hear their
That
accents.
train from New York. That train from New York, New York.
Crack train from New York.
That train from New York, New York. That train from New York, New York.
Okay, all right. And I think the second part is on a different, is on the next thing. It says part 2.
It's like 1 hour.
Oh, wait a minute. You're not,
It's like 1 hour.
no, if you go to different trains, part 2.
For a second, I thought they were saying crack train from New York.
It did. That's what it says.
Oh,
This is crack train from New York.
dang. Okay.
Well, I don't think in 1971 it had exactly that meaning.
Going with like 9 more years.
it's very difficult to hear what they're saying, but the text you can find, I think, on the internet. All right, so what's the difference between the effect of the first movement and the second movement so far? Well, first of all, the train whistles are different, and then this has the kind of air raid sirens in it, right? And I think this movement is kind of difficult to listen to. And so let's listen to the last movement, which is post-war, and he's trying to integrate the idea that after the war, many people that had been in the war and subjected to that untold horror had come to America, and they were now riding trains with other American people. So you've got all of the spoken parts fused together. All right, stop for a minute. Now, how is that different?
There's no recorded elements yet?
No, but what's the relationship of the, I mean, what's the string quartet doing? Is it playing these chords and splitting them up and repeating the rhythms? Not yet. So this uses what kind of device?
Canonic?
Yes, it's canonic. Right. Okay, let's go. So many, I've said in the past that in terms of minimalist, a fugue is a kind of minimalist composition. Yes, because it uses the same material in all of the voices. Okay, let's go. All right, stop. What's the general chord that's being prolonged here?
D minor.
What?
D minor.
It's D, yes? Okay. Do you remember what the opening was of the whole thing?
Maybe that.
Well, as an example of bad teaching, you might say, oh, well, he must mean that the opening is in D also. There is no, overall unity in the key. This ends in a different place. But there are these blocks of sound that are related to one another. I don't think that they form exactly a chord progression, but they do form a kind of harmonious progression of some sort, right? They're not totally unrelated to each other. All right, let's continue for a while.
Are you sure? Are you sure? War is over. War is over. Over.
Okay, and it goes on like that. Let's go all the way to the end. I encourage you to listen to the whole piece, all the way through it. And okay, let's just play the ending. Can you turn it up just a bit? That's it. All right, what did we end in? Anybody know?
A flat.
F?
Well, something like that. A flat and F is in there, and also D flat. Okay. All right, well, that's incredible. I think that, I don't know, there's something hypnotic and, to me, I guess it could be nostalgic, but I think there's something really creative and innovative about that music. Okay, let's take this for a minute. Steve Reich, pretty smart guy. He's a graduate of Cornell, and presumably had a degree in philosophy. Did you talk about him? Did you talk about Mr. Reich's education and so forth?
Basically,
No.
saw moments of it.
Yes,
But
moments of
didn't-
it. He has a degree from Cornell in philosophy. And then he went to the Juilliard School and then to Mills to study with Beria. But he's a pretty smart guy, very smart guy. And his ideas about music were written up in a kind of manifesto, and this is it, music as a gradual process. His doctoral dissertation was on Wittgenstein, or his dissertation was on Wittgenstein. And from reading this, you understand that it's not the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus. It's the Wittgenstein from much later in the philosophical investigations. Well, what's the difference between the two? Well, the early Wittgenstein tries to formalize properties of language and concentrates on a kind of Platonic view of language, in that there are universals governing the mind's generation of language, and it's more or less like a formal system. Well, later in Wittgenstein's life, he was more concerned with the nature of language as a social thing, and that he was concerned with meaning as represented in language. And he felt that language has no meaning except in its use in a community or in a social setting. And as a result of that, some people interpret that as a move towards a more like structuralist notion of language, or the modern view that language is a kind of learned by enculturation, that it's something that's out there that you absorb by exposure to culture, and there's nothing innately formulated in your mind. I actually think that's a misinterpretation of Wittgenstein, but in my opinion, the more appropriate way to look at that would be in Chomsky's distinction between competence and performance. Performance is how an individual uses the language, and that can vary and depend on cultural aspects. But the competence is what gives you the ability to use the language in a performance setting. And those are the universals, and that is a kind of Platonic view. And I think that's probably correct, that the brain is not a blank slate or a bowl of jello that, you know, you attach electrodes to and program it, right? It comes predisposed to acquiring certain kinds of information in very specific ways. All right, but this is Mr. Reich's manifesto, and there's some very, very interesting statements in this. And it expresses the kind of knee-jerk reaction to serialism that took place in the late 60s and the early 70s. I do not mean the process of composition, but rather pieces of music that are literally processes. Now we're off to a great start, because that's Schenker's idea, that music is a process. It's a process of unfolding, and it's actually a process of unfolding a single sound. And that is predetermined, actually, by nature. Right? So that's an interesting remark. Then, the distinctive thing about musical processes is that they determine all the note-to-note, the sound details, and the overall form simultaneously. Well, that's a double check, right? If the process, if musical composition or the expression in music is a process that is literally envisioned as simultaneously the sound to sound and all the details, then, you know, it's some kind of organic thing, yeah? Seems to be, that's what it's saying. Then the next statement. I'm interested in perceptible processes. I want to be able to hear the process happening throughout the sounding music. Well, we're still on course, because as a movement in sonata form unfolds, you definitely hear the different sections, yes? And if you're a musician and are perceptive enough, you can actually hear the connection between the individual sections and the individual phrases, yeah? Nobody's responding. Okay. To facilitate closely detailed listening, a musical process should happen extremely gradually. Well, now we're beginning to veer off into the ether a little bit. Does a sonata form unfold gradually?
Depends on how you use the word gradual.
Some more than others.
Are we talking like a Haydn symphony or like the Rachmaninoff symphony?
I mean, you always hear notes linearly, which could be considered a synonym for gradually. I mean, we're not hearing just like a dump of all the notes at once and then it's done.
Well, what about this? Is that gradual? That we didn't listen to a lot of it, but there are changes of tempo, yes? I don't think that's what he's talking about per se. Maybe he is. What does he mean by gradual?
I think we have to read a bit further to find out exactly.
What changes gradually? In four organs, what changes gradually?
The phase?
Yeah, phases, the length of notes, yes? And they are, that is not a new idea. That's an old idea. As a matter of fact, a lot of mess-ins, endless music. It depends on, that theory of fractional value augmentation and diminution, yes? How many hours have I spent playing all those rhythms exactly as notated? And then to have somebody say, oh, well, it's too accurate. It needs to be more musical, right? Consequently, I would never play any of that anymore. Okay. All right, sorry for the editorial. All right, to facilitate closely detailed listening, a musical process should happen extremely gradually. Performing and listening to a gradual musical process resembles pulling back a swing, releasing it, and observing it gradually come to rest. Or turning over an hourglass and watching the sand slowly run through the bottom. Or placing your feet in the sand by the ocean's edge and watching, feeling, and listening to the waves gradually bury them. Well, I don't think the last one is exactly right. I wonder what kind of wave that would have to be. But you got the gist. So what is he trying to say in that?
It takes a while.
Small incremental changes.
Small incremental changes, yes. Are there small incremental changes in the expression of a Haydn sonata movement?
Not really.
Well, it depends on your conception. If you're looking at it from a Schenkerian point of view, right, those changes do happen gradually over time. Yeah? And let's take the swing moving back and forth. Is there any kind of recursion in that?
Yeah, it goes back and forth and back and forth.
Yes. But then the gradual changes that what?
Goes back.
Distance it goes.
The distance it goes, right? Or the distance it travels, right? But the motion is exactly the same, yeah?
Hopefully.
What?
Hopefully.
Unless you have a hurricane force wind while the swing is going back and forth, right? That can create perturbations in the arc or whatever.
Or if the kid sitting on the swing is squirming around.
Yes, but he didn't put a person on the swing, apparently. He could have, actually. Or a bowling ball, okay? Though I may have the pleasure of discovering musical processes and composing the musical material to run through them, once the process is set up and loaded, it runs by itself. That's a very Schenkerian idea. He says that the musician or composer instantly has this conception of the whole. Even in an orchestral piece, the disposition of the sonority, and that is why the orchestration is closely knit with the unfolding of the composition, and that it is a process of linearization that brings the piece, the static conception, to a conclusion. Schenker actually uses the word static. He says music is a vertical event and it is a prolongation of a static entity or chord. See, most people don't really understand all that, what he's actually trying to say. Material may suggest what sort of processes it should be run through. Content suggests form. Well, I don't think there is any form without content, right? That's definitely the Schenkerian idea. That the content, what is the content in the Schenkerian sense?
Pitches.
That are
Recurrent.
by the process of the relationship of
Intervals?
Counterpoint.
consonance and dissonance, and the transformation of dissonance into consonance. That's the recursive process. Yep? Okay. All right, as to whether a musical process is realized through live human performance or through some electromechanical means is not finally the main issue. One of the most beautiful concerts I've ever heard consisted of 4 composers playing their tapes in a dark hall. Well, we can skip that one. It is all quite natural to think about musical processes if one is frequently working with electromechanical sound equipment. All music turns out to be ethnic music.
Are those two sentences related?
The one before it and this one?
Yeah. Because they're a paragraph. But
Well, what does he
I'm
what does he mean
confused.
by ethnic music? Maybe it does have something linked to the first sentence, like it's quite natural to think about musical processes. And if we take out everything after the if, all music turns out to be ethnic music, there might be a relation he's trying to get at there.
Maybe electromechanical sound equipment is its own ethnicity.
Ethno-mechanical sound?
I think that's like sound reproducing equipment, right? So you got 4 different composers playing their tapes, right, simultaneously. All right, well, hold on to that idea. We'll get back to it. I don't know, what does he mean by ethnic music? Well, all music is ethnic, right? Aren't we all like one ethnicity? African, right? Well, I mean, we have to go back a ways, right? Like 150,000 years ago. I'm so tired of that expression, right? But, you know, music historian X takes this to mean what I mentioned before, that in the 70s all this world music came to the front and you all of a sudden you were exposed to all these different kind of musics from different cultures, right? I don't know, is that what he's talking about here? What does this mean? It's quite natural to think about musical processes if one is frequently working with electromechanical sound equipment. All music turns out to be ethnic music. So, as you said, is the electromechanical process an ethnic process?
Maybe he's talking about his experience with electromechanical equipment, and then he's talking about how it's, you know, all music is ethnic when you think about the process enough.
Musical processes, this, you see, isn't this kind of imitative of the Tractatus of Wittgenstein? Yeah, it's a, you know, many people think that, oh, this is very mysterious. Musical processes can give one a direct contact with the impersonal and also a kind of complete control. And one doesn't always think of the impersonal and complete control as going together. By a kind of complete control, I mean that by running this material through the process, I completely control all that results, but also that I accept all that results without changes. Well, that's the essence of what? If you accept all the results without changes, what is that a characteristic of? Or used to be? Improvisation. Improvisation as I envision it. That you sit down and you improvise, and it's in a specific, has specific formal properties, and it is a completely self-contained entity. Now, whether you consciously are controlling that is a different matter. And I don't think Mr. Reich is thinking about that. But in the act of improvisation that produces an entity with that kind of description, you know, where it's formally controlled and everything is self-contained and expresses a complete unity, yes, every single element of that is under the control of your thought process, unconsciously, and as it is expressed phonotactically, either through your speaking or through your playing. So yes, it's under total control. You're just not aware of it. What kind of control is he talking about?
Electronics.
Conscious or unconscious? Or is he trying to mix those two things up? By a kind of complete control, I mean that by running this material through the process, I completely control all that results. Well, if you're completely running those things through the process of music as I understand it, then you do have complete control over it. But if you're thinking of a process that's outside of yourself, it's what? Come on. It becomes what? I mentioned this earlier in the TED Talk, the difference between instinct and intelligence.
Instinctual.
The notion that improvisation is instinctual and that composition is intelligence. So, he's thinking of this process as essentially what? Instinct or intelligence?
Instinct.
Really?
Completely controlling, but also accepting all the results without changes. It's like,
Yeah, well, it's mixed up, right? But the process itself, like a phase or an algorithm that generates that, is something that you devise, but once you set it into motion, it continues, right, to run without your input. Right. Well, there's a strange thing about that, because both language and music, in the way I think about it, does have that kind of recursive property, an algorithm that computes those recursive relationships. Whether you can express it algorithmically, I don't know. Chomsky says no, and I probably say no. But the process is similar to that. All right. Now this is a great statement. John Cage has used processes and has certainly accepted their results. But the processes he used were compositional ones that could not be heard when the piece was performed. The process of using the I Ching, or imperfections, in a sheet of paper to determine, this is a sarcastic remark, determine musical parameters can't be heard when listening to music composed that way. The compositional processes and the sounding music have no audible connection. Similarly, in serial music, the series itself is seldom audible. So therefore, serial music is instinctual or intelligent. Well, I would call it intellectual. Obviously, it's intellectual.
I thought you'd call it neither.
Yeah. Well, no, it's intellectual because the intellect decides that it's going to create this organization, which is not natural. But the odd thing about it is the process of thought is natural. But the result of that thinking process is unnatural. It creates a puzzle, right? All naturalistic music systems are not puzzles. They arise from some innate property of the brain or the mind. Now I remind you that there's an opposing view to that, which I think, of course, is totally incorrect. But there is another view, that it all, is just random. You make up. Languages are essentially made up from external influences. I don't think that that's true. All right, and this goes on, and I don't want to bore you, but I think we should move on to the last topic. Now, I would like to listen to a fragment of a composition by someone much more contemporary in his resources than Mr. Reich was in the 70s and the 80s. And we're going to listen to